a starting point in a certification in spiritual formation program, which I facilitate for the Richard and Julia Wilkie Institute for Discipleship. A starting point in that coursework is having individuals craft first raw definitions of spiritual formation, and then asking them to monitor and refine these definitions over time as we're about further discussions and engage additional resources. Initial submissions are welcomed for what they are, starting points, first efforts which convey initial impressions. Responses tend to be wide and varied, but nonetheless subject to categories. Most are Christian, or at least theistic, God-centered in nature. Not too big of a surprise there, as the Institute for Discipleship is pretty much a middle-of-the-road Methodist entity. Initial efforts tend to incorporate some combination of two or more of the words or elements now scrolling on your screen. Some individuals will add enriching metaphors, as for example, riding a river of grace or dancing with God. A few individuals will invoke a kind of universalism, affirming that all folks have spirits and all of us are about some process of spiritual development, making spiritual formation a universal over a distinctively Christian concept or dynamic. Through it all, as I've suggested, I affirm all submissions, invoking Richard Rohr's notion that everything belongs. And here I'll add, I can identify with those who argue for spiritual formation as a general commodity, a part of our common humanity. While Dallas Willard will go on to modify a distinctively Christian approach in spiritual formation, he begins his discussion of such with this more general affirmation and acknowledgement. Spiritual formation, without regard to any specifically religious context or tradition, is the process by which the human spirit or will is given a definite form or character. It's a process that happens to everyone. The most despicable as well as the most admirable persons have had a spiritual formation. Terrorists as well as saints are the outcome of spiritual formation. It's akin to Steve Macchia writing that all humans have rules for living, rhythms or rituals for life and living. Or again, it's there in the understanding that each and every human being has a meta-narrative or a worldview, a foundational, fundamental story or script that is the basis of inner beliefs and values on up to outer actions and beliefs. Altogether, these realities, that we all possess spirits that evolve and develop, that we all live by inner rules or rituals attributable to deeper stories and worldviews. All of these point to a spiritual dimension in our common existence as humans. All of these point to a notion of spiritual formation that pervades our human experience. But while we might all be spiritual in nature and all have spirits, there are clear variations in rules and rituals and worldviews and formations, and there are obvious differences in their cumulative and ultimate value. Yes, we might say everything may belong, but that doesn't mean that everything has equal value. C.S. Lewis seems to agree, affirming what we've already said, that everybody is about spiritual formation. But then he ends on a note of suggesting the ways that different formations lead to different results. Every time you make a choice, you are turning the central part of you, the part of you that chooses, into something a little different from what it was before. Taking your life as a whole, with all your innumerable choices, all your life long, you're slowly turning this central thing either into a heavenly creature or into a hellish creature. Either into a creature that is in harmony with God and with other creatures and with itself, or else into one that is in a state of war and hatred with God, its fellow creatures, and with itself. Each of us, at each moment, is progressing to the one state or the other. Spiritual formation is not an option. The inescapable conclusion is that life itself is a process of spiritual development. The only choice we have is whether that growth moves us toward wholeness in Christ or toward an increasingly dehumanized and destructive mode of being. Yes, we're all about some kind of spiritual formation, but different roads have different ends. Here, like Lewis, my identification is as a Christian, with an admitted preference for the ways set forth in Christ. But no sooner do I affirm this identity than I feel a strong need to air a word of caution. It is, by the way, a caution which I believe Lewis himself would have aired and shared. Here you see, I'm very aware, unconscious of so many out there, including dear friends and loved ones, for whom those words, church and Christian, raise all sorts of questions, if not suspicions. These questions, these suspicions are not unfounded, I'd add, as I acknowledge too many examples across time of Christians and the church misusing the gospel, neglecting, variously abusing individuals, physically, yes, but also emotionally and spiritually. Too many examples of Christians and or churches condoning ungodly alliances and injustices. But while all these acknowledgments fuel that sense of caution and a profound sadness and a sense of deep apology, while these realities have me appealing for a fresh set of eyes and ears and hearts in each and all of us, I nonetheless abide in my identification as a Christian with a decided preference for Christ and the ways that Christ informs spiritual formation. And here I invite you to consider the same, even if this means our hearing and respecting the invitation to see Christ and gospel plain in myriad, sometimes surprising, unexpected places all around. Like many, Robert Mulholland has been, for me, a favorite go-to in this work for the rather friendly ways he introduces and explores the notion of Christian spiritual formation. In his book, Invitation to a Journey, he tenders the following foundational definition. Christian spiritual formation is the process of being conformed to the image of Christ for the sake of others. Now, following his own example in the first part of his book, we might break down his definition as follows. Spiritual formation is a process. That is, it's an open, ongoing dynamic or operation in our lives. Spiritual formation is a matter of being conformed, with that passive voice being, underscoring that our shaping, our molding is not our own doing, it's something that's happening by the initiative, the power of an outside agent. Spiritual formation is distinctively Christian, as it sees us increasingly conformed to the spiritual image of Christ, clearly evidenced in a life of love that lives for the sake of others. While Mulholland's work is instructive, and his definition a great example of clarity, of precision, of holding together coherence, I don't hold it to be the end-all. Here I encourage you, as I do all those in these kind of courses, to be about the work of framing your own definition, holding it up against Mulholland's, and allowing them to evolve and adjust over time. My own definition of spiritual formation, for example, has recently evolved to a third version, version 3.0, which goes something like this. Christian spiritual formation is our graceful journey back home to God and God's kingdom. Holding it up alongside of Mulholland's suggests some areas of agreement, of real overlap. The journey. There's Mulholland's sense of a process. Graceful, mimicking his sense of this being something that passively happens to us. Back home to God, capturing some sense of his notion of our being conformed to the Christ and Christ's image and God's kingdom, implying, conveying some sense that all of this is not just for our own sakes, but for the sake of others. But note as well modifications or additions in my definition which reflect my own ongoing ponderings and experiences and sensitivities. There's the inclusion of biblically rich terms like journey and back home. They expand upon Mulholland's use of what I think is a drier word, process. Inclusion of these words has my definition resonating more fully, I believe, with images that figure prominently in the scriptures, and most especially with key images in the core teaching of Jesus, which was the parable of the prodigals. There's an emphasis on grace, which has a way of taking Mulholland's being conformed and ramping up, accentuating the great lengths to which the divine, the Trinity, will exhaust itself in this work. There's a regard there in the words back home to God for the ancient notion of reunion or union with God as the destination of the spiritual journey. It incorporates, I believe, Mulholland's notion of being conformed to the image of Christ, but it places it in a fuller and richer context and stream of thought. Finally, there's the word kingdom, which has a way, among other things, of emphasizing, at least for me, our solidarity with all of God's creation, and not just the human community, something to which Mulholland's phrase, for the sake of others, might too easily be reduced. In the coursework I facilitate for the Institute for Discipleship, students are exposed to further materials and discussions on the way to helping them refine their initial efforts. There's Mulholland, yes, but there are also introductions to stages of faith discussions via Janet Hagberg and Robert Gulick's The Critical Journey. And then there are considerations of the tug-of-war between our true God-given selves and the false selves which we can so easily put on and take off against the world's wild weather. At least that's how Buechner puts it. Inevitably, though, we turn our attention to a consideration of what spiritual formation is not, addressing major misconceptions and misassociations. It is something to which we'll turn in our next session, but not before I encourage you to be about a further digging into and with the materials and exercises which I've outlined and shared for this session.